Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to yet another edition of this special series from the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour on the REINS Act, the REINS Act in focus. I'm Andrew Langer, your host. Joining us right now, someone we've had on before, his name is Tim Frost. He is with the Cicero Institute. And Tim, let's get your perspective on this. You know, the question I've been asking everybody right at the outset, why is the REINS Act important and why is it so important now?
Well, thanks for having me on, Andrew. I think the framing of the REINS Act is important. It's an important lever of political accountability. You know, the reality is for far too long, Congress has overdelegated statutory authority to executive branch agencies to adopt rulemaking with no real check and balance on the back end of whether or not the intended delegation of powers has played out through the rulemaking process. And I think that's what REINS does from a framework perspective, is it creates that accountability mechanism for the executive branch.
And it really is about, we've been talking with folks. I mean, some of this, obviously, we talk about this in the context of deregulation and sensible regulations, but so much of this is about accountability. And it gets into another question I've been asking people, which is, if you are concerned about overarching executive branch power, right? If you're the party that is out of power in the executive branch, you are concerned about this, you should be in favor of something like the REINS Act, shouldn't you, to sort of keep an additional check on that power?
That's right. I mean, speed and simplicity in rulemaking is a double-edged sword. It can be manipulated across gubernatorial administrations, across presidential administrations. And so the Administrative Procedures Act, all the forms of the APA are important because it's a process.
Right.
It's a process-based reform. It's really not a policy-based reform. And so it injects transparency, it injects additional public input and process. And REINS is one additional lever for the public to have a venue to go through their elected individual, elected official to determine whether or not that agency rulemaking was appropriate.
You know, it's funny. I use the following quote from a Supreme Court case, 1992 Supreme Court case, as like sort of a North Star in terms of the way I approach these things. The Constitution protects us from our own best intentions. It divides power among sovereigns and among branches of government precisely so that we might resist the temptation to concentrate power in one location as the expedient solution to the crisis of the day. It sort of underscores all of what we're talking about, the importance of deliberation. And one of the problems is, right, if Congress no longer pays attention to what's happening in the executive branch, all of these things go out of whack. Or if the courts turn around and they say, we're going to give you extraordinary leeway, agencies, in how you interpret these things, it sends it out of whack. I mean, your thoughts on that? I mean, this is pretty much what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's exactly that. I mean, I think when a lot of conversations over the last few years, certainly post-COVID, as it relates to, judge decision making, agency rulemaking, DOGE, and all of those are structurally are going to have to come into terms with State Administrative Procedures Act and the Federal Administrative Procedures Act. If we want to see changes codified, regardless of what side of the aisle we're on, we have to go through the APA, and REINS creates that lever for us. And I think it's a beneficial lever that can be used in the right type of way to balance powers.
You know, it's interesting because there is this ongoing debate as to the legitimacy of the Administrative Procedure Act. I tend to be a devotee of the APA for the very reasons you laid out, that it does engage in this transparency. It does engage in this issue of accountability, this look before you leap. Because at the end of the day, right, the expression of government power, right, of executive branch power, I should say, bureaucratic administrative power, is the size and cost and scope of these regulations. So if you have a regulation that is going to increase that size and scope by somebody's measurement of $100 million a year or more, Congress really should take the next step of making sure that it doesn't diverge from what they said in statute, doesn't it?
No, that's right. I think, there's a piece of this of accountability to, a cost threshold, but I also think there's a deterrent effect with
Mm,
reins. If there's a known accountability to the executive branch or the judicial branch, decisions might be more tailored. They
sure.
might be more narrow. Rulemaking might be more precise. And I think that's all positive things for the American people. I think we have multiple state examples where reins, if you will, or simplified as a legislative review process is in place and it works. It doesn't take that long. We did a study in Idaho, where it's mandatory reins across all rulemaking. It's a part-time legislature. It takes on average less than 32 days to get done. The rejection rates are reasonable. It's around a 5% rejection rate, which on the flip side, when you're looking at it, that means 95% of all regulations are ultimately approved by both bodies. But those 5% matter. That threshold of high impact regulations matter. And there needs to be additional venues for the public to be able to go to their elected official to block or at least be heard in a different venue where they don't feel like that there's going to be agency response and problematic, returns on their business or inappropriate inspections or clawbacks, things like that. I think that's the value of reins that we don't talk about a lot is the deterrent effect that it's going to have on agencies.
And Tim, while we're in that vein, talking about state successes, a great deal of admiration, as you and I have talked about on this issue of Idaho. Let's flip that around also and talk about the ancillary negative impacts of regulatory reform. And the wailing, moaning, wailing, and gnashing of teeth by the pro-regulation, pro-administrative state crowd. None of their crises have come to pass. Talk about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always a question that, if you have regulatory reform levers, if you reform the Administrative Procedures Act and add in a reins, it's going to slow everything down. Businesses aren't going to be able to have a stable regulatory environment. Agencies are going to come to a grinding halt. They're not going to be able to provide the services. And the reality is, we have state examples is that is just not true.
Yeah.
Agencies are still able to go through the administrative process. Public have additional input. There's more transparency. There's more venues for them to get involved. That is positive on all fronts. And the legislatures of the states that have created a reins and legislative review have figured out a normal pathway that works for their state to review regulations. Most are shepherded through the process. Why? Because the Administrative Procedures Act is a negotiated process. There are public hearings, there are inputs, there are amendments to that rulemaking process. But there are scenarios where there is executive overreach. They don't have statutory authority to pursue the rule. They went beyond the bounds of statute, or just the rulemaking itself is an inappropriate cost to benefit analysis ratio. And in those types of scenarios, it's important for Congress and state legislatures to have that check and balance to rein back in that authority and to not deny a rule before it goes final.
So we're talking about this in the context of what's happening at the federal level, the back and forth between the House and the Senate on this. I don't know if you guys have any sort of skin in the game regarding this question of whether or not the Senate parliamentarian has overstepped her bounds in this case. I mean, do you have any thoughts on this about the whether or not the Senate should just go full press and push through? It's up to them ultimately whether or not this should be included. You guys have any thoughts on that?
I don't have, particular thoughts on the parliamentary, process interpretation. I do think, it's important for Congress to utilize the momentum of everything that's going on in the last few years, the new administration with Doge, post-COVID. The American people want accountability, and the American people want to know that they can be involved in the process of both congressional legislation as well as agency rulemaking. And I think that's why it's important for reins to be addressed now. I think we have a credible opportunity, and it would be a disservice to American people not to take that opportunity in this continuing resolution.
And let's talk about this also from the perspective of nonpartisanship, because you're a nonpartisan organization. You know, There have been a number of Democrats, a few in Congress, but elsewhere around the country who have supported these kinds of reforms. Talk about why this is important for, let's say, folks on the other side of the aisle, from Republicans to take a look at it, why they should be supporting these kinds of reforms.
Well, I think Democrats and many Republicans at times often recognize that rulemaking is the cost of doing business for big business, right?
Yeah.
The ability to capture a marketplace and capture a bureaucratic agency is business stability to block out marketplace competition. And so I think there's a lot of Democrats that have been trying to find ways to inject new innovation into business by looking at how is big business impacting the marketplaces.
Right.
And I think one of those framings is through regulatory capture and agency rulemaking. And so again, this provides a lever of accountability to think through, are there particular sectors where we've created a regulatory capture and regulatory strings tying down our businesses over time, preventing bottom up solutions? And I think the answer to many industries is yes.
It's interesting you bring this up because I just had this sort of flash. The massive regulatory state at the end of the day is a form of corporate welfare, right? And that's, you're talking about the issues of cronyism. They call it corporate welfare. Usually on our side, the free market limited government side, we call it cronyism. But at the end of the day, right? That's a message nobody has brought up yet. If you want to fight against corporate welfare, take steps to make sure that the regulatory state remains accountable and open to all actors in it. Tim Frost, how do folks find out more about the good work you guys are doing at the Cicero Institute?
Look us up at ciceroinstitute.org. I'm on LinkedIn as well as Twitter. And so happy to partner with folks as we continue to kind of create these opportunities for public to better engage with government.
Well, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Andrew.
Our guest has been Tim Frost. He's with the Cicero Institute. Go and check them out. This has been yet another episode, another installment of the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour special series on the REINS Act in Focus. I'm Andrew Langer, your host. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.